The fluorescent lights inside the Trenton Municipal Services compound hummed at a frequency that felt institutional, the kind of sound that belonged in holding rooms and filing offices, not in a place where living things were kept. The concrete floor was wet from a morning hose down, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with something older underneath, animal and fear and years of both. Sergeant Wade Okafor had worked the compound intake desk for 11 years. He had seen handlers come through those doors red-eyed after deployments. He had seen dogs carried in on stretchers. He had processed the paperwork for 23 K9 retirements in that time, and not once had the process felt like anything other than what it was: surplus management, government property being redistributed, line items cleared from a budget. He was not prepared for the woman who walked in that Tuesday morning in March. She was not what the room expected. The compound held 6 retired military working dogs scheduled for dispersal. The bureaucratic term for what happened when the Canadian Armed Forces determined a dog was no longer operationally viable. Some went to approved handlers, some went to law enforcement. 2 of the 6 currently housed at Trenton had been flagged as high risk, unsuitable for civilian adoption, pending assessment for what the paperwork called alternative disposition. Okafor had learned not to think too hard about what that phrase meant. The woman who came through the side entrance that morning was 26 years old. She had driven 7 hours from Halifax. She had not called ahead. Her name was Juno Farrell. She was wearing her father's old canvas jacket, the one with the frayed collar and the embroidered maple leaf on the left shoulder that had faded from red to rust over 20 years of wash cycles. She carried a canvas tote bag that clinked faintly when she set it down on the check-in counter, and she placed both hands flat on the laminate surface and looked at the sergeant on duty with the kind of stillness that had nothing to do with calm. "I'm here for Kodiak," she said. Sergeant Okafor looked up from his screen. He looked at her. He looked back at his screen. "Ma'am, this facility isn't open to the public on dispersal days." "I know." She did not move. "I'm here for Kodiak. Master Warrant Officer Patrick Farrell was his handler. Patrick Farrell was my father." The name moved through the room differently than any other words she could have said. Patrick Farrell had served with the Canadian Army's military working dog unit for 14 years. He had deployed 3 times, once to Afghanistan, twice to Mali, and in that time he had built a reputation that people in the Canadian forces described the way they described weather, with respect and a certain amount of reverence for something that operated by its own rules. He was not a man who talked about what he did. He was the kind of man who came home quieter than he left, every time, and who understood that this was simply the nature of the work. He had been killed 19 months ago, IED on a road outside Bamako that his unit had cleared twice before. He was 51 years old. Kodiak had been with him. The dog, a Belgian Malinois, 8 years old, 62 pounds of muscle and history, had survived the blast that killed his handler. He had been extracted along with 2 other injured soldiers, flown to a field veterinary station, and eventually repatriated to Canada. The official assessment described shrapnel scarring along his left flank, a partial hearing loss in his right ear, and what the behavioral file logged as significant trauma-related reactivity. Translated into plain language, Kodiak was dangerous. He had bitten 2 handlers since returning. He had destroyed his kennel enclosure 3 times. Every civilian placement option had been ruled out. Every law enforcement inquiry had been declined once the full file was reviewed. Kodiak had been at Trenton for 4 months, and in 4 months no one had come for him, until now. Sergeant Okafor pulled up the file. He looked at it the way people look at things they already know are going to be a problem. "Miss Farrell," he said carefully, "I appreciate you coming all this way, but Kodiak is classified as a Level 3 behavioral risk. That means, I know what it means. It means we can't release him to a civilian with no prior K9 handling experience, especially not this particular animal. He's had 3 documented, 2 documented incidents, and 1 near miss that was handler error, and it's in the notes if you read past page 4. She said it without raising her voice. I've read the file. I requested it under access to information in November. It took them 3 months to respond. Okafor set his pen down. Beside him, a younger clerk named Ben Hoagland, who had been pretending to type for the last 90 seconds, stopped pretending entirely. I'm not trying to be difficult, Juno said. Her hands were still flat on the counter. I drove 7 hours. My father spent 6 years of his life working with that dog. I am not asking for anything that costs anyone in this building a single dollar. I'm asking to see him. There was a long pause. Just to see him, Sergeant Okafor said. Yes, he looked at her for a moment longer. Something in the set of her jaw reminded him, uncomfortably, of photographs he had seen of Master Warrant Officer Farrell. The same economy of expression, the same refusal to fill silence with noise. I'll need to call my supervisor, he said. Take your time. She waited. She did not sit down. She stood at the counter with her tote bag and her father's jacket, and the particular stillness of someone who has already spent the better part of 2 years waiting for things that hurt to wait for, and had learned that waiting was simply something you did. The call took 14 minutes. When Okafor came back, he was accompanied by a woman in her 40s with short grey-threaded hair and the walk of someone who had decided things before she walked into rooms. Chief Warrant Officer Diane Sutherland, the compound's senior dog handler, and the person whose name was on Kodiak's behavioral assessment. She looked at Juno the way experienced people look at unexpected things, without surprise but with complete attention. You're Patrick's daughter, she said. It was not a question. Yes. Sutherland was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I worked with your father in Kandahar in 2009. He was the best I ever saw. The muscles in Juno's throat moved. She didn't speak. Kodiak isn't the same dog he was before Bamako, Sutherland said. I need you to understand that before we go any further. Whatever relationship he had with your father, that dog is in a different place now. He doesn't trust handlers. He doesn't respond reliably to commands. He has good days and he has very bad days, and on the bad days, the kennelers won't go into his enclosure without 2 catch poles and a muzzle. I am telling you this not to discourage you. I'm telling you because it's true. I understand, Juno said. Do you have any canine handling experience? No, but I spent 6 years watching my father work. I know Kodiak's command words. I know how he was trained. I know what he responds to. She paused. I know his name. Sutherland studied her. His name, she said. His real name. Not the kennel call, his handler name. The one my dad used. She looked steadily at the chief warrant officer. I'd like to try. The canine wing of the compound was separated from the main building by a set of double security doors and a corridor that smelled nothing like the front office. It smelled like dog and concrete and the particular metallic edge of stress, the kind that accumulates in a space where animals have been afraid for a long time. The fluorescents back here were older, one of them flickering at irregular intervals, and the sound of the kennels, low, constant, the shifting weight of large animals in small spaces, started before the second door was even open. There were 6 runs. 5 of them held dogs that watched the humans pass with varying degrees of interest. They were professionals, even in retirement, even here. They tracked movement. They assessed. They waited. The 6th run was at the end. The door was reinforced. The mesh was heavier gauge than the others. There was a laminated yellow card on the exterior that listed handling protocols in point form, and a second card below it with an emergency contact number and a single line in bold. Do not enter without authorization. Juno stood in front of it and looked through the mesh. Kodiak was in the far corner, facing the wall. He was not pacing. He was not reacting to the sound of their approach. He was simply there, his back to the world, in the way of an animal that has decided the world is not worth engaging with. His left flank caught the flickering light. The shrapnel scarring was visible even through the coat, a rough geography of healed tissue that ran from his shoulder toward his hip. One of his ears sat slightly lower than the other, the edge ragged where it had been torn and sutured. He was thin in the way working dogs get when they stop caring about food. "Hey," Sutherland said, in the practiced neutral tone of a handler approaching a reactive animal. "Hey, Kodiak!" The dog didn't move. "He's been like this for 3 weeks," she said quietly. Before that, he was crashing the gate. Now he just stopped. She didn't elaborate on what she thought that meant. She didn't need to. Juno looked at the dog for a long time. Then she took one step closer to the run and said, quietly, in the particular cadence of a word she had heard 1,000 times at kitchen tables, and in hallways, and in the recorded voice messages her father used to leave when he was deployed, and wanted to check in on the dog back home. The world inside that kennel changed. It did not change the way things change in films, all at once, and with music underneath. It changed the way real things change, which is in pieces, and with a lag that makes your chest hurt while you wait for it to finish. First was the ears. Both of them came up, the good one and the damaged one, swiveling back and then rotating forward as though recalibrating a frequency they had almost given up on. Then the shoulder blades shifted, the spine realigned, and then Kodiak turned around. He did not rush the fence, he did not bark. He stood in the middle of his run and looked at Juno Farrell with eyes that were the deep amber of old glass. And something moved through them that had no training protocol and no clinical terminology and no place in any behavioral assessment form Sutherland had ever written. He took 3 steps toward the gate, stopped, took 2 more. His nose hit the mesh. Juno pressed 2 fingers against the outside of the fence, at nose height. She did not speak. She waited, the way her father had taught her to wait, which was with your whole body and without any need for the moment to be faster than it was. Kodiak's nose moved over her fingers. He breathed in. He breathed in again. Slower, the way dogs do when they are not smelling a person but reading them, sorting through the information in layers, the way a reader moves through a page, finding what matters. He exhaled. And then he sat down, right there at the gate, 6 inches from her fingers, and looked up at her. Behind them, Ben Hoagland, who had followed the group back on the pretense of administrative necessity, put his hand over his mouth. Sutherland did not move. Okafor looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at the floor. Phantom was his working name, Juno said, to no one in particular. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not. My dad never called Kodiak at home, said it was a boundary thing. The kennel name was for the kennel. The working name was between them. She was quiet. I've been saying it to myself for 19 months, practiced it so I wouldn't lose my nerve when I got here. Sutherland was silent for a long moment. How long did you drive? She finally asked. 7 hours. From Halifax. Yes. Another silence. Your father left a next-of-kin form with the unit, Sutherland said slowly. Standard procedure for handlers with long-term working partners. In the event the handler is unable to continue service. She paused. Most people don't fill that section out. He did. Juno turned to look at her. He put your name down, Sutherland said, for Kodiak, 18 months before Bamako. The sound in the kennel corridor was the hum of the fluorescents and the quiet wait of dogs in their runs, and Juno Farrell breathing carefully so that she would not come apart in a government building in front of people she did not know. Why didn't anyone contact me? She asked. Her voice was very even. Sutherland looked at her for a long moment. There was something in her face that was not quite guilt, and not quite bureaucracy, and was, in fact, probably both. There was a processing backlog, she said. Repatriation cases, post-incident assessments. It moved through 3 different desks. By the time Kodiak's file was complete, the next-of-kin section had been flagged for review because you have no K9 handling certification, and the review was pending. She stopped. It has been pending for 4 months. Juno absorbed this the way you absorb information that makes you want to sit down, which is by not sitting down. My father's dog has been sitting in that run for 4 months, she said, while someone's paperwork was pending. Yes. While he was flagged for, what did your intake sheet say? She glanced back at Okafor. Alternative disposition, Okafor said nothing. That's what they call it, Juno said, not angry. Not quite. Something harder than anger and quieter. That's the phrase. For a dog with a Silver Star unit citation. For a dog that pulled 2 people out of a vehicle in Afghanistan before father finished his first deployment. That's the phrase they use. Through the gate, Kodiak was still sitting. He had not moved. He was watching her with his amber eyes, his damaged ear tilted slightly toward her voice. Sutherland took a breath. Miss Farrell, I want to be very clear with you. The process exists for reasons. Kodiak has genuine behavioral challenges that are not going to resolve because of one visit. If we were to move forward, and I am not saying we are, there would be requirements, handler training, facility assessment, an evaluation period. She looked at the dog. He is not easy. I want you to understand that he is genuinely not easy. I know, Juno said. He has bitten 2 people, I know. He may never be fully stable in a civilian context. Juno looked at Sutherland. Chief Warrant Officer, I'm not looking for easy, I'm looking for my father's dog. A pause. He has been alone for 19 months. So have I. In the run at the end of the corridor, Kodiak stood up. He moved to the gate and sat down again, his shoulder pressing against the mesh from his side and 2 of Juno's fingers still resting against it from hers. And the gap between them was 4 inches of chain link and nothing else. The evaluation process took 6 weeks. That was the compressed version. 6 weeks because Sutherland pulled the next of kin form from administrative review and escalated it directly to the unit commanding officer. Because she called in a favor from a civilian K-9 trainer in Belleville who agreed to run an accelerated handler fundamentals course, and because she wrote 3 paragraphs in Kodiak's updated behavioral file that she would later describe to colleagues as the most important thing she'd put on paper in 11 years of service. The paragraphs documented what had happened in the kennel corridor on that Tuesday in March, the physiological changes in the animal's behavior upon hearing his handler name from a specific individual, the sustained calm he displayed for the remaining 40 minutes of the visit. The fact that when Juno finally stood up to leave, Kodiak followed her movement to the gate and sat there facing the exit for 2 hours after she was gone. Sutherland did not editorialize. She wrote what she observed. The file said what it said. Juno drove back to Halifax that same evening. She drove back to Trenton the following weekend. And the weekend after that, she completed the Handler Fundamentals course on a Saturday in April, in a training facility that smelled like rubber matting and optimism, alongside 3 retired police officers and a woman from Peterborough who was retraining her search and rescue dog. She was not a natural handler. She was honest about this. She had good instincts and poor technique, and she made mistakes that a professional would not make, and she absorbed the corrections the way her father had taught her to absorb hard information, which was without drama and with her full attention. The civilian trainer's name was Russell Gay. He had trained working dogs for 28 years, and he had seen grief before, in handlers who'd lost dogs and in people who'd lost handlers, and he recognized what he was looking at in Juno Farrell. He did not say anything about it. He corrected her grip and her body language and her command timing, and he told her she was progressing, and he meant it. The first supervised interaction with Kodiak was in the 3rd week. Not in the run, in one of the compound's outdoor assessment pens, a square of packed gravel surrounded by chain link. Sutherland was present. Gay was present. An animal behavior consultant named Dr. Priya Osei, brought in from the University Extension Program, stood at the edge of the pen with a clipboard and did not interfere. Kodiak was brought in on a lead by a kenneler who had been working with him 3 times a week. The dog was muzzled. The lead was heavy. His ears were flat. Juno was standing at the center of the pen. She waited. She did not approach. She let him process the space, the smells, the people at the perimeter, and finally her, in the order that made sense to him. When he was 8 feet away, he stopped and looked at her. She said his name, both names, this time. The kennel name and the working name, in the sequence her father had used, the one she'd heard in home videos and voicemails, and the story he'd told at the kitchen table, the night he came back from his first deployment, about how a dog learns who you are, not from what you say, but from how you say it, and whether you mean it. Kodiak crossed the 8 feet. He pressed his head against her sternum. She put her hand on the back of his neck, between the scarred shoulder blades, and stood still and let him breathe. Dr. Osei wrote something on her clipboard. Then she stopped writing and just watched. The formal transfer took place on a morning in late May, in a room that was too small and too warm, and had a water cooler in the corner that gurgled at irregular intervals. There was a desk and several forms, and a moment where Sergeant Okafor, who had been managing the administrative file since the beginning, cleared his throat 3 times before he could read the transfer confirmation out loud. The forms acknowledged that Kodiak, callsign Phantom, operational service record appended, commendation citations included, was being transferred to the care and custody of Juno Farrell of Halifax, Nova Scotia, under the provisions of the Canadian Armed Forces Military Working Dog Retirement Protocol, next of kin priority placement, Section 4, Paragraph 2. Juno signed where they told her to sign. There was a moment after the last signature where nobody said anything, and in that moment, the water cooler gurgled, and the fluorescent light above the desk buzzed, and from somewhere down the corridor came the sound of a dog that had been waiting, and had finally heard the right set of footsteps coming toward him. The drive back to Halifax took 7 hours. Kodiak sat in the back seat. He had not been in a vehicle since the military transport 19 months ago, and for the first 40 minutes he was rigid, his body tight against the door, his breathing audible. Juno did not speak to him. She drove. She put on the radio low, the CBC, a program about the history of the St. Lawrence Seaway, a voice that was calm and factual and filled the cab without demanding anything from anyone. Somewhere past Moncton, the tension went out of Kodiak's spine. He lay down, not flat, not fully relaxed, not yet, but his legs folded and his head came to rest on his front paws, and he watched the road through the windshield with his amber eyes and breathed at a pace that was no longer emergency pace. Juno watched him in the rearview mirror. She thought about her father in the front seat of a truck, a lot like this one, on the highway between Ottawa and Petawawa, the summer after his second deployment, the dog asleep in the back, and the radio on, and the conversation she'd had with him about what it was like to come back. She had been 17. She had not known what to ask, exactly, and he had not known exactly what to say, and so they had driven in a silence that was not empty, but was instead full of the particular closeness of people who share a language they haven't quite put words to yet. She understood it better now. She did not know what would come next in any specific sense. She knew that Kodiak was not fixed, and that she was not either, and that the 6 weeks of evaluation and handler training had given her tools but not certainty, and that there were going to be hard days ahead in a house that already had plenty of hard days built into its walls. She knew that the trauma of Bamako lived in that dog the same way it lived in her, not as a memory that could be removed, but as a shape that everything else had to arrange itself around. She knew that Russell Gay had given her his personal number and told her to call any time, day or night, that first month especially. She knew that Dr. Osei had said, at the end of the final assessment, that she had never written a more unusual recommendation in 15 years, and that she was glad she had written it. She knew that Sutherland had walked them to the compound gate and had stopped there and had not said anything, just nodded once, with the expression of someone doing the math on something complicated and coming to an answer that surprised them. Past Amherst, the highway flattened into the long, straight causeway approach that meant Nova Scotia. The light was different here, lower, greener, the particular Atlantic quality that Juno had grown up with, and could not describe to anyone who hadn't lived inside it. The sky was overcast in the way that sometimes resolved to rain and sometimes to something softer. In the back seat, Kodiak lifted his head. He looked out the window. His nostrils widened. He was reading the air, whatever came through the crack at the top of the glass. The salt and the evergreen and the specific chemical signature of a coastline that said, to animal senses calibrated for information far beyond what humans can pass, something about location and what came before location. He looked at the back of Juno's head. She met his eyes in the rearview mirror. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. There was a thing her father had told her once, sitting in this same stretch of highway going the other direction, with the dog asleep in the back and the radio on, and the whole length of his last return ahead of them. He had told her that the best moments with a working dog were the ones that didn't require anything of either of you. That presence was its own communication, when you had built the kind of trust that let it be. She had not understood it at 17. She understood it now. The house in Halifax had a yard with a back gate that opened onto a small park, and a front step where the paint was peeling in the way it had been peeling since she was 12, and her father had started the job 3 separate times without finishing it, and a kitchen table by the window where she had sat across from him on more mornings than she could count, while he drank his coffee, and read the paper and said nothing, and was in that nothing completely present. She parked in the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off. Then she opened the back door. Kodiak stepped out onto the pavement slowly. He tested it, front paw first, then the weight distributed, the way a careful animal approaches new ground. He looked at the house. He looked at the yard. He looked up and down the street, cataloging, assessing, running the same behavioral calculation he had run in compounds and checkpoints and vehicle staging areas on 3 different continents. He looked at Juno. She walked to the front step. He followed her, not on a lead. She had unclipped it in the driveway, a decision that Gay would have told her was 6 weeks too early, probably, and that she made anyway, because some things you know before you can justify them, and this was one of them. He walked beside her, a half step back, and to the left, in the position her father had told her, was called the working heel, the position a trained military dog maintained, not because he was commanded to, but because it was where he had decided to be. She opened the front door. He went in. She followed him. The house smelled like her father still, in the particular stubborn way that spaces retain people long after the people are gone. The cedar blocks in the closet, the specific brand of soap he'd used since before she was born, the particular quality of light through the kitchen window that had always made the whole room feel like something was about to be said. Kodiak stood in the hallway and breathed it in. He went slowly through the rooms the way he had gone through the assessment pen. Not searching, not anxious, but deliberate. Living room, hallway, the closed door of what had been her father's study. He stood in front of it for a moment, his nose at the gap beneath the door, and she watched him and did not speak. Then he turned around and came back to where she was standing in the kitchen doorway. He sat down at her left side, in the position, looking forward. She stood there in her father's jacket in the kitchen of her father's house, with her father's dog at her left heel and the light coming through the window the way it always had. And she understood that some things did not end the way you thought they were going to. When you first heard the word end, and that some things that looked like loss were also, if you waited long enough and drove far enough and said the right name at the right gate, something else too. She put the kettle on. Kodiak lay down across the kitchen floor in the spot by the radiator that she would later learn he had decided was his, and he closed his eyes, and in the particular quality of a Tuesday afternoon in late May in Halifax, with the CBC murmuring from the counter radio and the kettle beginning its slow climb toward boiling, he slept.